welcome back to the Azure Terraformer. I am just now digging into the HashiConf materials and sessions that I missed because of all my hallway shenanigans. Now, this talk I actually went to. This one's the Meet the Experts Terraform Module Design, which I think is a fabulous topic. I see this topic come up over and over and over again on Reddit. There's really no definitive or canonical comprehensive guide on this topic. So I think it's an area where there's just so much nuance and biodiversity in terms of the various flora and fauna of what is a Terraform module and what is it doing? What is it trying to accomplish? We don't have definitive texts like domain-driven design is for traditional software development. So Terraform developers are often left to our own devices to kind of figure out what works. So it's really great to see some of these experts come out and share their words of wisdom on the subject. Anyways, this is a reaction video. So I'm going to watch this talk and I'm going to react to it because apparently they ran out of chairs for the talk and there were only 3 chairs. And, I just didn't make the cut. So I thought, I've got a chair right here. I might as well use it. I'll share my thoughts and philosophy of Terraform module design with you guys. And you guys let me know what you think. Anyways, let's go.
How's everybody doing? Has it been a good day at the conference? Come on, get a little more energy. Bruno here is very nervous, so we have to make him feel right at home.
Super nervous.
I'm
Ned
think
Belvin,
Bruno's nervous.
and today's topic is module design best practices. And since I don't know anything, I brought on these 2 fine gentlemen who know a lot. So let's start with Bruno. Who are you? What do you do?
Hey everyone, I'm Bruno Schaatsberg. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp, and I'm opinionated on modules.
So say we all.
And, Drew and I actually met through the core contributor program a couple years ago. We used to work on the AWS provider together.
Still do a little bit.
I still do a little bit. Yeah. And in the past, I used to be responsible for a large internal library of modules. And I like to talk about all my opinions. Yeah.
All right, excellent. And Drew, welcome.
Hey everybody, I'm Drew Mullen. I'm a principal architect at Riverpoint Technology. I think from a module design standpoint, if you've seen any of my work, it'd be through the AWS IA repos, which are a bunch of, when I was at Amazon, we published a bunch of different kinds of Terraform modules. And yeah, been in this ecosystem for a while.
Great. So let's start with the fundamentals. What do you take into consideration when you're getting started to create a module? Like, what do you need to know ahead of time before you write a single line of code? Bruno, what about you?
It's a good question. It's not so much coding, actually. It's talking. A lot of talking to the different stakeholders and the ones that are using the module eventually. I always like to think, looking at the broader perspective, as a platform engineer or a platform engineering team, I usually like to think of it as running a business. If you build modules without talking to your customers, they likely don't end up buying it. And if customers don't end up buying anything, you're doing the wrong thing.
Basically, the perspective that he's representing here is if you are developing a portfolio of modules that folks within your organization are going to start consuming, you can publish, as many modules as you want, but if people don't actually use those modules, you're basically, singing in the wind, right? So doing a lot of activity with not a lot of impact. And I mean, this is like classic software development. Like, if you build it, they will come. That is not a guarantee, right? Just because you build something and you think it's cool, doesn't mean it's actually going to be helpful for other people, right? So you kind of have to talk to people. You have to think about the problem. I mean, he jumped to talking to people, which I think is important, but maybe he's not calling this out. You got to think through the problem. You got to think through the problem space. Maybe he thinks that's implied, but so many times I see so many Terraform projects where, people don't actually think like, should this be a module or not? They're just like, it's got to be a module. Let's make everything a module, right? But the first step is to think about it. Should this be a module? Okay. Once you've landed on yes, I think it should be, then the question is, who's going to use it? And the answer to that question is going to drive who you should talk to Bruno's point. So I think it's a good answer, right? But he's got some baked in assumptions that, maybe it's probably just from his context, from his experience, the way he develops the way he develops modules and the way his modules are typically consumed. That's just the way he thinks about it. But, there's many different situations where reusable modules are going to be, percolated throughout an organization. You have to think about, is this module going to be used outside of my team, right? I mean, that changes who you need to talk to, right? If you're developing your own modules and you're in an organization that has kind of empowered, different teams, not just one central governing body to be the arbiters of like module development, then you need to think about the context in which the module is going to be used. And if you happen to be on one of those ordained teams where you guys are the arbiters of like module development, then you need to recognize your own distance from the actual problems of the developers that are going to be consuming your modules, so that, I think as Bruno is pointing out, you don't design in a vacuum and people end up like not using your modules because they fall flat. So
common mistake that's made is that people start building Terraform modules without talking to their end users to really understand the use case.
Yeah.
So it's talking.
Talking. Okay.
I would argue, like, if you don't understand the use case, you shouldn't even start a module, right? Like if you, and this is where I believe organizations should democratize module authorship and module development, because all too often, and this is more of a general problem in the DevOps space, right, where people get pigeonholed as like DevOps people, which I think is a terrible like failure of our industry, right? In that DevOps has become like a role, not like a culture, right? But this concept of like, oh, there's a team that just sits there and pumps out modules, right? That is not, that is not a great idea, in my opinion, because if you have a team that is pumping out Terraform modules come in all shapes and sizes and affect many, many different scenarios. And so you really should strive to have a scaled organization where these teams that are actually close to the problem are empowered to canonize their own solutions through infrastructure as code, through Terraform, and basically take ownership of that module development rather than pass that buck, pass the torch, delegate that responsibility to some third party that really has no idea what their problem is, right? And is going to, is going to be rife for opportunities for miscommunication, confusion, and delay. So that's my opinion. I've always strived to create organizations where there's more ownership closer to where the problems are being solved, closer to where people are in context of the problems, rather than create kind of governing bodies that are detached, centralized governing bodies that are detached from the problem space. So that's just me.
Same thing for you, Drew. Like, what sort of questions would you ask the stakeholders about the module?
Sure. So a big first question to ask is whether or not the module is going to be public or private.
Fair.
If you're going to be publishing something to the public, then you have a lot different type of scope that you might be trying to achieve. And I think scope is a big question that you're trying to answer. When Bruno was pointing out, like, you want to talk to your stakeholders, you want to understand like what scope is in and what is out, because the more flexible your module is, sometimes the more complicated it is, and you might see less adoption. You know what I mean?
I see. So usability is a big factor.
Absolutely.
And obviously, if it's a private module, you can talk directly to the people that are actually going to consume it. If it's going to be a public module, then you are serving a wider audience that you don't necessarily have the input from.
Mm-hmm.
So you've decided to make a module.
However, if I think kind of a similar like thought process can be applied to whether it's going to be a private module or a public module. It just comes down to like how opinionated can this module be? And honestly, like you can still like the idea might be you might take from that like, well, if it's a private module, then I can be extremely opinionated. If it's a public module, I can't be extremely opinionated. I disagree with that fundamentally, right? I think some modules, I think some of the best modules are highly opinionated and they solve a very specific problem. And those highly opinionated modules they don't try and solve all the world's problems. They solve a very specific problem. And you can publish that to the public, because, there may be people that are trying to solve that specific problem. So I think one of the fallacies and one of the problems that module developers, often fall into is that you have to like create a module that's so generic, that solves so broad of a problem space. If your target audience, if you're going to publish it widely, right? I think that is a fundamental logic error. Okay. Because it neglects to recognize the utility of a highly focused, opinionated module that solves a very specific problem. Okay? A specific tech stack, a specific, solution, right? Anybody out there on the internet could take advantage of that. Now, does that mean that everybody on the internet is going to take advantage of that? No. But people that have that specific need are going to want your specific module. So why go create a legion of Swiss Army knives when somebody's just looking for a scalpel or somebody's just looking for a pair of scissors, right? Go publish your scalpel. Go publish your pair of scissors. Don't feel like when you publish a module out to the internet, it has to solve every single person's problem on the planet. Big problem there.
Gathered the requirements for it. One of the fundamental things you need in a module is inputs. What is your approach to what type of input variables should be there? What should have a default value ever? Do you do validation? Like, where do you start, Drew, with?
Inputs are probably the most important part of a module's boundary. I think of modules as essentially a software component, a class, right? That you instantiate. I mean, it's perfect example of that, right? In traditional software development, you author a class, and the class has internal implementation detail that it hides from the consumers of that component, of that class, right? Typical object-oriented programming. Now, just because like I'm using object-oriented programming principles in this very specific context does not mean like you should go OOP like all your Terraform modules, okay? But like, I think from that sense, a module does adhere to some principles of object-oriented programming design, which includes, this idea of encapsulation. And anytime you encapsulate, some implementation detail, there's going to be a boundary, right? Of like what the edge of that container, of that box that encapsulates whatever's in that box, right? And so input variables are that inbound interface, to that component. Outputs, likewise, are the outbound interface, right? In my book, Mastering Terraform, I talk about each individual Terraform resource and data source and essentially modules, being a very simple machine, like a function in math, right? F of X, we all remember F of X, right? F of X takes input and it produces an output in the most simplest case, like X is the input, F of X is the output, and something's happening inside of f of x. Something's happening inside f of x, that is kind of abstracted from us, right? So at its very simplest form, a module is essentially the equivalent of like a function in math, or a class in traditional programming. So that's how I think about it. And Ned's absolutely right. The interface, both inbound and outbound, is an important surface area that requires thought and design.
Input variable.
I think that's the most crucial question to get at the beginning, is because your module, what you're presenting is an abstraction. And so the shape that your variables take is exactly the same the way that an API presents a shape. So that's the contract that you start to form with your users, right? So
exactly. Contract, interface, like whatever you want to describe it, like that's like we are talking about the same thing.
How are you going to organize your variables? And often it can be as simple as just a straight up Boolean or like a single variable. But also, like, you can structure your modules using like types and objects so that you can actually make inputs that kind of organize the module in interesting ways that your users might make it easier for them to actually start using.
Yeah, and I tend to agree. Like, I've seen, and I'm sure we've all seen these modules that have like hundreds of primitive type input variables. With everything's a string, right? And it's kind of the same concept from traditional programming, right? If you're writing a method or something like that, and you need to pass in a bunch of data to it, well, are you just gonna like have this never-ending comma delimited list of string parameters that you pass into this method, or are you gonna package some of those values, some of that data, into data transfer objects, right? It's the same design concept from traditional programming, right? And the usage of data transfer objects within Terraform modules and between Terraform modules is something that you have to be careful with, right? Because unlike traditional programming like C#, Java, Python, whatever, right? It's so much easier to do object creation and do object manipulation using imperative code. Using HCL and functional code, it's not as straightforward. It's not as easy to maintain. So that is one just purely pragmatic and practical perspective that you have to consider, is object construction is not going to be as easy as it is with C# and Java. So the same decision matrix of like, yes, I should put this into a data transfer object, because should be definitely entered into, should not be used with infrastructure as code, within the context of Terraform and HCL, right? I think you should try and defer. You really need to make a hard decision about the complexity, of like, should I package these together? What impact is that going to have? Is that going to create additional work for like inside my module? Is that going to make my module less predictable in terms of, when we run Terraform apply? Because I've seen a lot of modules where people do all sorts of like complex objects, and then half the module's internal implementation is just like gymnastics in HCL, like slicing and dicing these huge aggregate complex objects that are input variables, which ultimately adds complexity and potentially, worst case, impacts the determinism of that module. Basically, if I make a change to this object, is it going to be known after apply or not, right? So you want to definitely make sure that your module, produces a reliable plan. And so sometimes starting off with your inbound interface of your input variables with complex objects can lead you down an internal implementation path inside the module that will lead you down a path of where that module becomes less predictable when you run Terraform plan, because there's so much internal calculations and gymnastics happening that Terraform can't get reliable answers from your module of like what the values are going to be. So be very careful. That's my recommendation. Be very careful using complex objects on your input variables. I'm not one of those people that says never do it, but you definitely, want to err on the side of simpler structures and not overtly, complex object graphs. I would, big O notation is a thing. I would highly recommend staying in big O to the first power, like big O to the, where n equals 2. You got nested objects as an input variable. You're in trouble town. It's very, very dangerous. You're playing in very dangerous waters, because you're going to get to a place where the overhead of that developer that's using your module is going to increase, because they're going to have to start trying to figure out this elaborate new and proprietary meta language that you've defined in your input variable object structure about how to configure your module. This, in my opinion, is a major anti-pattern that you can find in these mega modules that like do everything under the sun that's known to mankind. And essentially they become their own like little ecosystem where you can specialize in just the input variable manipulation of that particular module. This is not good. I don't think this is a good path, because it further bifurcates like the knowledge space. It makes it further fragments the specialization of our infrastructure as code capabilities, and that makes it harder and harder to find general purpose practitioners that can be easily swapped in and out, right? You have to, become more of a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche, right? No longer am I just like I'm not like, there's no such thing as just a generic Terraform developer, right? There's Azure Terraformers, there's AWS Terraformers, there's GCP Terraformers. Of course, we all know Terraform, right? But like, you really have to understand how Terraform works on Azure or on AWS or on GCP in order to be productive and efficient there, right? So when you start cultivating these modules that become their own ecosystem in the same way that Azure and AWS and GCP are, right? Now, we don't just have Azure Terraformers. We've got, very specific module, implementation of Azure on Terraform, right? And it becomes unmanageable. So you be careful with that.
So, controversial question possibly. What's your feeling on very complicated data structures for inputs versus a simple string or a Boolean?
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm personally not afraid of complicated module inputs. I think the key with that is that you have to provide good examples and good validation. So validators can be a really nice way that you can give someone feedback if they're missing, the right type of argument that you're expecting within the object or something like that.
I tend to agree, but I'll put an asterisk, right? Because of everything that I just said, right? I'm not afraid of having complex objects. Like, we can use the object, type. But I am afraid of when those objects become too complex, right? Again, that's relative. T-O-O. It's a relative term, right? So it requires judgment to assess when an object has become too complex. But a complex object can be too complex, in my opinion, and it will yield non-deterministic Terraform plans, and it will yield unruly internal local shenanigans, all these crazy gymnastics. And thirdly, it will yield, this additional specialization, required to like divine this new meta language that you created as your input variable contract. So be careful.
And I quickly want to add to the default values. So I think an underrated practice for default values is using null. Many people think that null is nothing. Null is actually nothing. Null represents the absence of a value. And if you set the default value for null for an input argument for your module, Terraform actually omits it, and it's not passed down to the resource, which ends up that you fall back on a default value that's specified in the schema of the resource and the provider. And if that doesn't have a value, it actually falls back usually on an upstream default value in an API.
Oh, interesting. So if I could...
That is correct. When you have one layer of module touching resources, but when you have a module that touches another module, that behavior does not manifest. So be careful with that. He's absolutely right. Null is something you really need to think about. And oftentimes, if you're authoring a module, it's a really good idea to default, input variables to null if it's an optional attribute, because then once you set the variable, like ultimately on the resource block, you're going to set an attribute to that variable value. But if the consumer of your module doesn't provide a value to the input variable, then essentially the null value will be used, which means you're going to default to whatever that resource, defaults to. And as Bruno pointed out, sometimes if there is no default, then the platform that you're targeting has its own default. So definitely you need to be thoughtful about using null. And if it is truly like an optional thing that you don't necessarily require, you should absolutely set it to null and not something like empty string or empty array or an empty map, right? These are actual values. They're not going to actually set the default, right? Like it would if you use a null.
Read that back to you. What I'm understanding is if I put a default value of, say, an empty string, that's different than setting it to null.
Very different.
Because the empty string would actually get passed as a value for that argument, whereas null is no value set. So whatever your default value is, use that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Precisely.
And I think any line of code that you write, it's a line that you have to maintain, and setting default to null actually lessens the burden of maintenance. Yeah.
Why would you set a default of null versus just not setting a default at all?
If you don't set a default at all, it actually triggers you to input something. Yep.
Right. Okay, so you're forcing the end user to provide input in that case.
If it's an optional argument, then I set the default value to null. Yeah.
Which, this is also an area that you need to be, that you should also be thoughtful about as a module developer. When do I actually want to force my end user to make a decision, right? And for me, there's a few, short lists of this. Anytime that it has a significant impact on cost. We all work in the cloud, right? So if the value can really impact cost, I'm not going to accept a default. Like they have to provide me something, because I don't want to be responsible for them spinning up, business critical GPU laden like SKUs, because that happens to be my preferred default, right? So also region, I think is another one that a lot of times I don't know why people do defaults on region, but like, dear Lord, like if there's anything we can ask people to be decisive about is what region you want to go to, right? Like we shouldn't be defaulting to a region unless it's like a lab or something like that, in which case use a rando. But people should have to choose what region they want to go into.
If I think it's a required input argument, I don't specify anything, and it prompts them to supply value.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have our input variables, and one of the other things that's closely tied to input variables is local values. I have opinions on where local values should reside, but Bruno, why don't you tell me where and how do you place local values inside of a module?
Sure, yeah. So I really like the concept of strong cohesion in Terraform files, meaning that anything that I deploy.
I'm a big fan of strong cohesion in general, but I think I'm about to agree very violently with Bruno right now.
Should live together.
Okay.
Previously, I used to split out all my infrastructure, so you'd have an EC2.tf and an IEM.tf and a DNS.tf, and even though I was deploying 2 or 3 applications, all my infrastructure was scattered all over those files, and locals would live in a locals.tf.
Okay.
At some point,
I think everybody's done that at some point, and just to be clear, like I think I'm trying to understand like what he's describing, like in terms of splitting out like everything into different TF files based on functionality. Because in my opinion, I think that's actually like a good thing. I still do that, right? But I'm wondering if like he's looking at it from kind of the horizontal aspect of like, are there layers of the architecture that are more vertical in terms of the slices of functionality as opposed to the horizontal layers of the actual services that we deploy to. Because if that's what he's saying, then I fully agree with him, in terms of like how to compartmentalize stuff. But once you're at, one of those vertical layers of your architecture, right? I think it's absolutely okay to kind of organize them based on the horizontal services that they have, like IAM.tf or compute.tf or storage.tf, right? Within that vertical layer, you can have horizontal segmentation because it's like easy to find stuff, right? There is cohesion in that I've organized this root module to be, a particular vertical within my architecture. But within that vertical layer, within that vertical segment, I have horizontal kind of organization within TF files. That I think is a totally valid approach. The point about locals being next to the resources that they are used in, I absolutely agree with. I do often see people that just dump all locals in a locals TF file, or they use prefixes like locals.blah.tf. I'm not a big fan of that. I think you can have a locals.tf if you have globally used locals that like globally within the module, right? Like they're used across multiple files. And there's really no good place, to put it in context because it's used so many places. Then, a locals.tf would be a good place for that. I often put it in main.tf, because for me, main.tf is kind of that like, this is contextualized across the entire module. So often, like if there's a few locals that are used across the module, I'll slam them into main.tf because that's kind of like the place that people start. It's like, here, let me look at my main. This is the global context for this module, which makes sense that there would be global locals in that file. However, you should absolutely, like if a local is if it's only used within one resource, then it's essentially like relegated to that resource. You should declare it next to that resource. And this is kind of like in software design, like if you're defining a class, right? If you're going to declare like a variable, like a string or an int or something like that, and it's only used in the method, then it should be scoped to that method. Now we don't have that same construct, in Terraform, in HCL, right? The closest thing we can get to it is if you have a local variable that's only used in one resource, then you just declare that local right next to the resource. It's essentially like kind of, keeping them together. Likewise, if you have a class member variable, like a string or an int or an object that's used across many methods within your class, and it's like the internal state of that class, then you're going to declare it probably at the top of the file, like within the class, so that people can see it, right? And in my mind, that's where these global locals, would go in a locals.tf or in a main.tf, right?
I started to change that a little bit up, and I now have, for example, application_x.tf, and the load balancer lives in there. The EC2 instances live in there, and the DNS entries, for instance, live in there.
So now this is what I was talking about earlier. It sounds pretty clear that he's starting to compartmentalize based on vertical. Like in my mind, application X, that's a vertical, right? And within application X, there might be vertical layers within its architecture, in which case they should be busted out. Now, in my opinion, application X should probably be its own module, right? So like, yeah, I might have application X.tf, but that TF file is not going to have a whole bunch of individual resources. It's probably going to have just a reference to a local module that encapsulates application X, right?
Local values, you don't have to. I think a common misconception is that folks only think that they can declare a locals block only one time. You can actually have.
I hope people don't have that misperception. Yeah, he's absolutely right. Like the locals block is one of the weirdest blocks in Terraform. I think it's one of the only block types that you can have multiple things inside of it. And there is no object reference whatsoever, right? It's essentially just like a placeholder. Like, hey, you can put as many locals in here as you want. Every other block type is very different, right? There's some sort of unique identifier for that block type: resource, data source, input variable, output. All these different block types have some sort of unique name that they're referenced by. Locals, it's a little bit weird. It's a little bit different. And as a result, you can declare as many locals blocks as you want with as many locals in them as you want, as long as each individual local is globally unique within that module. Its name, the local's name, that's what I mean.
Blocks multiple times. So what I like to do is that the local values are declared on the top of the Terraform file.
Okay.
That's where I'm using them. It's and any local that is generic or that's used throughout all the different Terraform files, I specify in a locals.tf.
Interesting.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think Bruno and I agree on this. I would say, to his point, if like to expand further, if at local is only used by resources within one file, then yeah, probably put it at the top of the file, right? But I wouldn't do that kind of dogmatically, right? Because if a local is used only in one resource and that resource is at the bottom of the file, I'm not going to put that local at the top of the file. I'm going to put it right next to that one resource that it's used at. Now, if I end up start using that local in other resources, then I have to kind of revisit where that local is going to exist. But that's okay, because locals are so flexible. Like, you can easily move them around, but the point is you want to put them close to where they're used so that you don't have, future authors, including yourself, have to go on some wild goose chase to find where this freaking local comes from, right? And that's what you're trying to do. You're optimizing for readability and maintainability.
So you're actually placing multiple locals blocks across different files, but you still have somewhere to put sort of the global locals, if you could call it that.
Yep.
That's the same
Exactly.
term I used.
Drew, how do you feel about that approach?
I'm pretty similar. So shared should go in a shared location. If they're shared across multiple files, ones that are isolated to a single file goes at the top. And then sometimes I'll even get creative and like, if I have a single local that's only going to be used for one resource, I might put it immediately above it. Because in that circumstance, the only time that you're ever going to look and reference it is when you're looking at that individual resource.
Completely agree.
Okay. All right.
I think we're good on
input variables and locals, which brings us to the actual resources and data sources that are usually the point of a module. I know there's like the labels module that only just creates strings, but aside from that one, you're usually trying to create resources. You can make resource creation optional, and you can also create multiples. And I feel like that's a point of contention for you, Bruno, on the use of count and for each inside of a module. So why don't you explain a little bit about how you feel about those meta arguments?
Yeah, nice one. This is where I get very opinionated. So to me, looping constructs are a necessary evil. As much as I think they're sometimes nice to have, they usually bite me back. So I live by two sayings: count on it only when you must, where I try to say only use a count when you really need to.
Okay.
And I think the only time when I really need to use a count is when I run into a modeling problem, which is when I want to deploy a conditional resource.
Okay.
For instance, I only want to have this resource on dev or on prod. I'll use a count combined with a ternary operator. But I still somehow think it seems like a modeling problem, and I always try to optimize for not having to have the count there. So then I'll think, should I move this resource outside this root module or child module? And then for
a couple of points, right? So using basically the ternary conditional operator with a count to make something on or off. I think I sense in Bruno's answer that he like many, feel that this is a bit hacktastic, but it's the best thing that we got for optional stuff, right? So, short of like some, top level meta argument that does the exact same thing but triggers off of a Boolean, right? Count and a ternary conditional operator is pretty much the only way that we can do on and off stuff. And I really don't see any problem with doing on and off stuff. Like, in fact, it's necessary. Like you're gonna encounter situations where you have to do on and off. You have to handle conditional. Should I do this? Should I not? Should you try and avoid that if possible? Yeah, but not to the point where you're doing unnatural things, I would say. So I don't consider conditional on-off kind of logic to be taboo or, something to be overtly concerned about, but it is something that does add a little bit of dirty, especially when you think about situations where, well, how well does my module respond to when I oscillate between true and false? Will my module be successful when I turn off that component and then turn it back on? Or am I going to run into apply time failures when those scenarios are exercised? That's usually the big problem, that I encounter when I set up conditional stuff. And it's just something that you gotta test and you gotta think through, to make sure that it works smoothly.
I have a saying that I live by, which is for each resource a different one. And I always try to optimize for the least amount of for eaches that are declared in my Terraform configuration. Because anytime I create a resource with a for each on it, and I have to reference it somewhere else, that ends up with a looping construct as well. Because then they're being referenced.
Absolutely.
So if I have 4 identical resources that I need to deploy, I would actually declare them separately.
So the same resource block 4 times, one for each thing.
So that way I avoid any time where I reference that resource, that another resource also ends up with a loop.
I mean, he's basically advocating for kind of a wet approach. Write everything twice, as opposed to a dry approach, which I think is perfectly fine. However, I don't know if I'm as scared of for each loops as maybe he is, but I definitely have been in those situations where, like, if you have kind of this cascading, resource, sub-resource, sub-sub-resource with for eaches, it gets pretty hairy pretty fast. So likewise, just recently I did a code review for one of my code ninjas, and I found a situation where they're basically hard coding object blocks just for the sole purpose of being able to iterate with a for each. So I definitely like his principle here, right? Don't use for each when individual blocks will do, because iteration just adds unnecessary complexity. Another thing that I would say is you should try and scope your module to minimize the number of for eaches. So if I'm creating a root module and I notice that I'm for eaching across every resource block in my module, then what it probably means is I should probably bust out a module that encapsulates all of those resources with singular instances of those resources, And then once that collection of resources is encapsulated within a module, now I just for each across that module, right? Just that one time, right? I covered this principle in my book, Mastering Terraform, where I discuss my principles of module design, right? And this is the idea that you should seek to extract iteration outside of the module, right? So try and avoid plurality within a module, right? Again, avoid. It's not like a dogmatic, like thou shalt not, put a for each inside of a module. But like, if you can iterate across the module block one time, rather than iterating inside the module across all of your resources n times, then you should iterate one time across that module block. That's my principle.
And I typically don't deploy 100 or 200 things or n of something. So I don't typically run into the situation.
See, that's weird. I encounter this all the time. Now, maybe not 200. That's a bit of a straw man. But like, I encounter situations where I have to provision multiple n of something all the time. Like this is an extremely common scenario. What do you think? Is this a common scenario for you? Let me know in the comments below.
I deploy the same resource 200 times. So I can get away with declaring those resources separately. And sometimes, like I said, looping constructs are a necessary evil. So I'll actually end up, like in Google Cloud, you have to enable APIs first before you can use them. So
I know.
Yeah. So there I would use it for each.
I do that in my book in the chapters on Google Cloud, and I for each, over the different APIs that I want to provision, because it's like, it seems very, very simple and the right way to do it. So yeah, I think we both agree here.
You just loop over a set of APIs and I enable them. So.
Drew, what's your feeling on it? Because I don't know if I entirely agree with Bruno.
So here we do differ a little bit. Where we agree is on count. Count is basically used as a Boolean for me. You either have 1 or 0. Other than that, I hardly ever use count. But I really do like the for each construct for resources.
So there's a lot of hate for count. I just want to address this, right? Because count can create churn. And if you're going to be publishing reusable modules to the public internet, I would say try and avoid count, right? But I've also encountered kind of a design consideration where using a map as the interface is often kind of unnatural, as opposed to using a list is much more simple, right? So in those situations, I'll expose a collection as a list to keep things simple for the person consuming my module, but then I'll use a for expression to convert that list into a map, such that when I iterate across a resource block, I'm going to use for each iteration as opposed to count iteration, which eliminates that churn. So you kind of have to balance like interface design, to keep things simple for your consumers and not like pass that complexity onto them, but also maintain kind of simplicity and reduce churn of day 2 ops. But if I'm not super afraid of the count meta argument either, but you have to go into it eyes wide open, that ultimately, if you're going to modify that list, you're going to do drop creates, right? So you better have a good understanding of if that's going to impact your architecture, in any shape or form, if you're going to have to drop create those items within that list, if you make changes, right? But I think count's fine. You just have to think about the churn, the potential for churn. But I wouldn't go through and do radically unnatural things if there's no impact on churn.
I think part of it may even have to go back to what I was saying about complicated variable structures. So for example, I have a VPC module where the subnets are defined in a map and you can use any key you want. And the nice part about when you design a variable that way is now I have a map that's n in length or however many keys. And then I can use that to define the for each loop. And now each subnet as it comes up gets as the name label actually what I used as that key.
Right.
So you can actually get kind of, I think you can actually make your outputs look very clean when you start doing things that way because your resources actually have name labels on them too.
Interesting. So
Yeah, I agree.
Two different approaches to the problem.
Yeah.
And I can see pluses and minuses to both because I have run into that scenario where I'm creating 5 of this VM, which means I need 5 of a network interface for that VM, and I'm going to have to use a for each loop for both. If I know exactly how many I'm going to need, then not using the iteration might actually be easier. But if I'm leaving it up to the consumer of the module, then I might use the more complicated input variable.
It may also come down to the whole private versus public thing too, right? If you're writing modules that are privately used, then you're a lot more likely to know the scope. And if something's public, then you're generally writing a more flexible module. So it might have to do with something like that too.
And
We've talked about that, and a more flexible module could be taken in many different ways. I hope that he doesn't necessarily mean less opinionated module. I've talked about that, but yeah, like I mean, I think a good example of this is if you're writing a module that needs, something stamped across, a certain fault domain, whether it's availability zone or region, right? Do you hard code, region 1, region 2, or AZ1 or AZ2 or AZ3? Or do you create a list or a map, for the region deployments or the AZ deployments and then iterate across that? In my mind, like I would strive to make it dynamic based on that collection of fault domains that I want to span, because I wouldn't want to necessarily hard code like 2 fault domains or 3 fault domains or 1 region or 2 regions or 3 regions or 5 regions, right? So you have to consider that, right? So, but again, it does boil down to scope, right? Am I ever going to want to support more than 2 regions? Answer that question for yourself. If your inherent architecture is, for example, like you're using a relational database that has kind of A/B failover, you're probably not going to need, 2+ regions, right? You're probably going to be always at 2 regions. Now, if you're using like a clustered horizontally scalable database like Cassandra or Cosmos DB or something like that, now we're talking N region replication, right? And so you might want to consider like not fixing the number of regions that you deploy across. Just a thought.
I used to optimize really for dry code. So I used to be someone that declared for eaches everywhere, and I was optimizing for least amount of lines in my Terraform code and seeing how sophisticated and fancy I could make it. Until I realized that it always bites me back in terms of maintainability and usability and readability.
Using like tautologies like words like always or never, I mean, it's rife with risk, right? I completely agree. Like you should not like optimize for dry code. But at the same time, like you don't necessarily need to optimize for entirely wet code either. I think there's a middle way, right? And it takes judgment to kind of decide, how much kind of iteration you want based on your architecture, your scope, your goals, and how much flexibility you want for the future. But absolutely, like if you optimize for elegance over readability, maintainability, operability, then it's going to bite you in the butt, right? It's not going to be fun. So definitely, I think a lot of traditional software developers like myself, like come to infrastructure as code, and we're used to kind of like operating within these environments that we can achieve like these levels of technical elegance and not pay the penalties for it. But in infrastructure as code, that's just not the case.
when I started to optimize for the more declarative approach, like least amount of for eaches. Yeah.
Right. And I do want to get into module testing in a moment, but there's one last important thing that modules have that we should probably address, and that's outputs. So, Drew, when you're thinking about designing the outputs that your module emits, what's your thought process and what's your preferred structure for outputs?
Yeah, so a little bit of a hot take here. I decided early when I was starting to design modules, I decided early that I never wanted to receive an issue from a user that was like, can you please output this attribute from a resource? I just never wanted to see that.
Okay.
So
Reasonable.
my strategy has been to output resources and to do it in such a way so that if you're doing like a looping construct or something like that, you can actually use Terraform to output the group. And then you can use those name labels, like what I was mentioning, so that users can actually key on and get the specific values that they want. So it does add a little bit of a burden on the users, though, because it can be a little bit more complicated. And so what I try to do is include good examples on how you can actually use the outputs of the module.
This sounds a little crazy. It sounds like he's basically just dumping every single attribute of the resources that he provisions within his module as an output, as one complex object output. And it's not clear to me how much shenanigans or how much HCL gymnastics he's doing, whether he's doing for expressions or whatever, or just like dumping the raw output. But this sounds like a really not ideal situation. I definitely wouldn't want to use a module that does that. And it comes back to kind of like object-oriented design, like this principle of encapsulation, right? We don't need to know everything that's happening inside the module, right? So as the module author, you should consider what the inbound interface should look like, and you should cultivate a well-formed inbound interface. And likewise, you should think about what somebody who's consuming your module is going to need from your module, and you should cultivate a well-formed outbound interface. I think just dumping all of the raw output is, frankly lazy. I get where he's coming from, right? It's like, I don't want to, like, I'm working so hard on these modules, like I know people are going to come and be like, hey, can you output like XYZ? And like, I didn't think about that because like, I don't know why anybody, like I didn't have the foresight to see why anybody would want to use that. But like, frankly, I think, in my opinion, like that's the natural process of like coming up with that well-formed outbound interface. And I think you should do that as a module author.
Output the entire object, the whole resource, with all the attributes and the nested blocks. And okay, I see. Interesting. Oh.
Wow, I think Bruno's being super nice. Like, interesting is not the word that I would use. I would say ugly. I don't like this. I'm sorry. Like, I don't like this approach at all, So I think this is a place where Drew and I just kind of disagree. And that's fine. That's fine. But I definitely, I don't want to output anything unless I feel like it's absolutely needed. So I think that's where your starting place should be. And then, as requirements come up, like then it's like, okay, I need this, add it, right? But don't just like output stuff just to output stuff, right? I'm not a fan of that.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it's not something I do, because I think if you do that, you need to be very consistent. I guess then all the modules that you publish internally would have that way of outputting things, because to a user it might be a little bit confusing otherwise. But I can see where it helps, because at the end we build modules as like building blocks, and we try to offer a certain abstraction. And if they want to, the intent is that they build on top of it. We don't want to. I don't want to force my company or teams to use modules everywhere.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be nice that you then output the resources. I always try to output all.
Bruno's kind of like moving into that camp, but I don't think this is a good idea, folks. Please don't do this. Please don't author modules where you dump the outputs of all your resources. Please be thoughtful about what the output value should be. And I'm not saying, you can't use complex objects as outputs, but like, don't just like dump the raw resource output, like, data, as your outbound interface. That's totally a dereliction of duty, in my opinion.
The attributes, and I sometimes run into issues where someone says, "Hey, I really need this value. You haven't outputted it. Can you create an output for it?" I like the idea. Nice.
I think part of that discovery
Agree to
discussion
disagree.
that you have at the beginning could help alleviate that issue. If you can identify the outputs that they're expecting to get from the module, then you can have more succinct outputs that are easier for the end user.
I completely agree with Ned here. And honestly, this kind of goes back to Bruno's original point. You got to talk to your stakeholders, right? The biggest part of talking to your stakeholders is like what outputs they need, right? So I think this approach to outputs of a Terraform module is a dereliction of duty. You got to talk to your stakeholders, find out what outputs they need, and give it to them, right? Don't just like dump on them. Maybe this is unpopular opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you want me as a module author just to dump every value of the resource known to man? Or do you want a very concise set of outputs that would be expected by you as the consumer of my module? Let me know. I'm probably not saying that in the most unbiased way, but throw your comments in the comment section below and let me know.
To consume, and then you could expose the entire resource as a different output if you think that's going to be helpful to them. So you have both options.
Do you do this in those public modules
See,
as well?
I don't know if I agree with Ned's stance on this. Like, if you're going to go through the trouble and create a nice, well-formed, concise outbound interface, you're not just going to then also dump everything, right? I've really never encountered this. Like the idea that you would just dump all of the output of your module as one output value just is so foreign to me. I'm having a very hard time seeing how this could be a good idea.
Yeah, both.
I mean, the only benefit is for it reduces effort on the module author's side of not actually having to talk to their stakeholders to understand what outputs they need and to cultivate that well-formed outbound interface. That's the only benefit that I'm hearing. So, yeah, not a fan.
I would be concerned about a really complicated resource, say something like an AKS cluster that has a million attributes. Dropping that as an output and leaving it up to the end user to parse is putting some work back on them, whereas you might want to be a little more prescriptive about exactly what you're exposing, because a lot of those attributes are never going to be relevant to the end user.
Absolutely. Ned, whoo, absolutely, man. Like, preach it, brother. Preach it, brother.
I see your point.
They're so polite. Like, I see your point. I violently disagree, but I see your point. Interesting. It's a good idea. I don't know. Like, I'm with Ned on this one. Most of these resources are gonna produce so many outputs. It's just gonna be noise. So part of the responsibility of being a module author is to shield your consumer of that noise, both by creating rational inputs and rational outputs. If you don't do that, you're just passing the buck on to your consumers. And really, what value are you adding as a module author? So that's my take. Maybe it's a hot take. Maybe it's an unpopular opinion. Maybe it's confidently incorrect. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below.
All right, so let's move to day 2. You've published a module. You're starting to get feedback. You need to update the module. How do you deal with breaking changes?
We break software all the time, right? Yeah, I think that's all about communication. It's perfectly fine to break software. I think every project, software that doesn't break in terms of a breaking change is a little bit weird. Like I said, it's all about communication. I think an industry-wide standard is using a SEMFR, semantic versioning specification, to communicate breaking changes or enhancements or bug fixes.
Yep.
So if you use SEMFR, which I would highly recommend, bump a
Semantic versioning, basically 1.0.0, right? You have the major releases as the first numeric value, minor releases as the point release, and then patch fixes as the ... point release, I guess. Which patch releases should have no breaking changes. Minor releases, you might have breaking changes, but they're not like massive. And then major, a major version, like there's some expectation that like there's going to be significant effort. But both major and minor, like there is a non-zero effort involved in upgrading. There's no guarantee that there's zero effort. Whereas a patch release, the expectation is that there's not going to be a lot of, there's really no effort. Like you can take the patches pretty freely.
And communicate it to your users. And make sure from a user perspective, so the module users pin their module version, so they are pinned to a particular version of that module, and they don't pull in the latest breaking change. And from a...
Always be explicit, right? Use, specific versions of the module.
A module author perspective, it's communication, bumping a version, and providing some guidance on how to deal with breaking changes.
Yep.
I think the AWS and Google provider are an excellent way of providing both backward and forward compatibility and providing those guides how to upgrade from V4 to V5.
Drew, when you're making a change that's not a breaking change, say an enhancement, do you bump the minor version? Is that a patch version? How do you think about that?
So patches are typically bug fixes or minor, or not literally minor, but something like a doc fix or something like that. Minor versions for me are any new feature that you're adding.
Okay.
A new resource or anything like that, as long as it doesn't break.
100%.
Can I ask a question as well?
I suppose.
So what do you bump if you bump so you have a module and that depends on a provider, like the random provider, and the random provider now gets an upgrade as well. What do you bump? Is it a minor or a patch?
Yeah, so typically I consider, unless I'm bumping a provider a major version, I consider upgrading providers a part of like a minor version.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And just
So, Bruno raises an interesting point. I think it depends, like relative to your, like most things, it depends relative to your module. Upgrading from that version of that random provider, how does that affect your module, right? How does that affect the people that are using your module? If there's no impact, then it could be a minor release, right? If it's going to cause people heartache and they're going to have to make changes, then, you're going to have to. It could be a patch release. If it's going to require a non-zero effort, if it's going to require a non-zero amount of effort, you're going to have to consider a minor or a major upgrade. Now, the random provider, it's probably just going to be like a patch, worst case, like a minor, because that thing doesn't change very much. It's a very stable provider.
to clarify for those who aren't as familiar, the provider is inherited by the root module that invokes the child module. So they might want to use a slightly different version than you tested the module with. When you're setting the required providers settings for the child module, do you typically pin it to a major version and just let it be whatever minor version?
I tend to prefer to upgrade them when necessary. So,
Okay.
If I'm making a structural change, like for example, when the S3 bucket changed a big time from 3 to 4, right? Like, if you're adjusting your module that way, that's a breaking change in your module for no doubt. But like, Otherwise, I typically won't update the provider unless there's a new feature that directly impacts a resource that I'm using.
I bump providers all the time, actually. Because it's super easy to bump from 1.1.1 to 1.1.2. I just keep doing that on a regular basis using the Penabot or whatever. I've noticed that it is super hard to bump major versions. So if a module is on 2.0.0 of a provider, like the AWS provider, and they haven't updated it on a weekly basis or monthly basis to keep up with the provider, migrating from V2 to V4 is one heck of a job.
Yeah, a lot of things change.
Now, one thing that they didn't get into the details on is how should you set, and I think this was Ned's question, is how should you set your required providers, version constraints? Should you do equals, right, and pin it to a very specific, to exactly one version of the provider? Or do you do greater than or equal to, right? And my experience has been like, I for modules that I'm going to reuse, I need to make them more flexible because the root module is going to drive, what version of the module. The root module is going to drive what version of the provider we use, right? And that they might bump, that root module version up. So for my reusable modules to not force everybody to pin on a specific version, I usually just say greater than or equal to, right? Now, maybe that causes problems. I don't know. What do you use? And maybe we'll hear from them, what they use. But for me, it's like, okay, I know that this functionality is going to be there, right? So as long as you take this version or higher, like we should be good to go. However, this doesn't really cover me. Like if there's, like, let's say I'm on 3.16, right? And then there's a 4.0, right? Technically 4.0 is greater. I might run into problems, right? So, one would think that, like, as you're developing this module, right, you're going to try and keep pace with the provider's, versions that you're using. So when there's breaking changes, you're going to update, and use semantic versioning to be like, okay, now we're going to upgrade to, 4.0 of the Azure RM provider. Here's version, 2, or 1.1 of my module. And people that want to use Azure RM 4.0, they're going to have to use this, right? So that's kind of how I do it. It kind of balances the flexibility of the reusable module, like to not force everybody on a specific instance of the module, but then within the root module, allow them to choose, what specific instance of the providers that they want to use. In the root module, I'll always use a pessimistic equivalence operator, right? Like the squiggly, caret kind of thing, because I want to accept patches, but I don't want to take any other new versions, right? That's how I do it in the root module. In the reusable module, greater than or equal to. That way, as people bump, the minor versions within the root module, like I'm not like holding them back from using future modules. However, that doesn't necessarily protect them when we hit major releases. That's how I do it. Let me know in the comments below what you think about that.
Especially in the AWS provider in that time. Maybe some breaking changes. That may have bit me once.
We're a bit guilty of that.
So when you are bumping the provider or making other changes in the module, you probably want to test that.
Absolutely.
Bruno, what is your preferred way of testing modules?
Nice. As I said earlier, I always think of building modules internally and providing them to different users you're building a little product.
Yeah.
And what goes unnoticed, or I think it's a very underrated thought, is that as a platform engineering team that provides modules to the entire business, or to all different teams in a company, you're indirectly responsible for all those workloads running on your module. And a lot of people don't think about it that way, but if the module breaks and it causes an outage, they'll actually come to you and say, hey, something weird happened with the module.
Right.
But back to testing, because I treat it like a product, I test it from a few different perspectives. So I test the unit of work. Is what this module is intending to do working? So I'll deploy it to a temporary sandbox account where we had some CI/CD set up that if we made a change and we merged it, part of the merge check would be to deploy it, run a couple tests using Terraform Test. Terraform Test is really good at deploying a set of resources and actually running the checks and then tearing it down. Then I also like to test for breaking changes. The input arguments that I have, is there any breaking changes in that interface? The interface of the module. The interface are the input arguments and the outputs, the attributes. I do that with Terraform Test as well. And I really like to use input argument validation. Oh.
One thing I didn't hear is like when you have breaking changes, right? Or just when you're upgrading versions, doing point A to point B testing. I didn't hear this. I didn't hear this. So that's just one thing that I would add. I think the rest of what he said is making a lot of sense to me. I mean, Terraform Test is relatively new, but I mean, it's essentially doing what we did previously. And for Terraform module libraries that I've developed, in former life at different companies, I mean, we would do the same thing. We would essentially bootstrap these modules, and we would run Terraform plan, Terraform apply, Terraform destroy. That's essentially what Terraform Test does, right? It just provides, kind of some grease to the skids, so to speak, to streamline that process for that specific use case, testing, which didn't exist previously. And now that it exists, it just makes it that much easier, to build tests. Like you don't have to go do all that plumbing yourself, which is very nice.
So this just occurred to me, and I want to get your take on it. If you add a new input variable to a module, and it's a required one, do you consider that a breaking change?
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you're gonna have all of your users are gonna have keyboard input waiting, to supply that input variable value. If you're using that module, they're literally going to have to modify how they pass input values into your module in order for it to work.
Prompts for a diff. Yep.
Okay.
Well, if they bump the provider version and pull my latest required input argument, it will produce a diff, and I consider it a breaking change. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, because it doesn't seem like a breaking change. You're not creating a new resource or altering an existing one, but the person who's consuming the module is now going to get an error because they haven't provided a value for that argument.
It's the same. It would be a breaking change from a provider perspective as well. Say you have the S3 resource and they suddenly add an attribute that you must now set as well. It would be a breaking change there as well.
True.
Yeah. So to come back to the testing question, Drew, what about you? What's your preferred process for testing your modules?
So I'm a big fan of Terraform Test. For a long time, we used TerraTest, and I think TerraTest is really great for what it can do, but it has this burden of being written in a language that not a lot of people know if they're just coming to use a Terraform module, so it's hard to expect your users to run those.
Right.
The one thing that I'd add into testing is that I think, so when you structure your modules, you typically will see the module code, you'll see examples, you might see a docs directory or something like that. But examples are one of the first thing that people click into. Like if you look at GitHub views, like my example directories are where a lot of people spend a lot of their time.
Absolutely
true. So I always try to make sure that we have tests that are testing the example repos.
Oh,
this is a really great point. I mean, and it's like it's a 2-for-1. So it's a win-win, right? Why wouldn't you do this? I think it's a brilliant idea. Like you definitely should be doing this, right? You're gonna have to write examples that exercise different scenarios of your module. You might as well reuse those examples as your test scenarios. Plain and simple.
interesting. Okay.
To me, that's basically you've defined the major use cases that your module is trying to achieve. And so writing tests that use those, you're validating that the use cases you intend work.
Yep.
And you're also validating that the documentation that you're offering and the form of example is still valid.
100%.
Right, so it serves
2 for 1, baby.
that dual purpose of I have these examples which are supposed to be guidance on how people are using the module. If I make a change to the module and those examples don't work anymore, that's a problem. But also I get to test the intention of the module by leveraging those examples. And that's pretty easy to do with the test framework, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It
I
is.
really like the idea of testing the examples. I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and to your point, it's
Me too.
actually very low overhead. You just define the test and you point to the source. You know,
Violently agree. Yes.
it's pretty
I
straightforward.
think same for provider development. I recently run a workshop on building Terraform providers, and someone asked the examples that the provider provides, can we
Man, I'm going to have to go to that training course because I want to build a new Minecraft provider for Bedrock.
automatically test those? So that triggered my thought. It's nice to do that for modules as well. Yeah.
One of my things that I really care about is documentation. What do you think of when it comes to well-structured documentation for a module? What needs to be there and what would you like to see there, Bruno?
So I always try to think of, can you imagine using Terraform without documentation? That would be absolute pain.
I cannot.
I really like, so kudos to the team that built it, Terraform docs. I use it a lot. It's a tool that you can use to generate the documentation for your module.
When
Super easy tool to use. Super easy to add a prefetch commit so that basically when you submit a pull request on a feature branch, it'll automatically update the documentation based on the changes that you made within your pull request. So all you gotta do is get your pull request approved, merge it in, your code's updated, your docs are updated, easy peasy.
you say Terraform docs, you're not talking about the documentation on the HashiCorp website. You're talking about the tool that is called
Exactly.
Terraform docs. Okay.
Good clarification there, Ned. Terraform-docs, to be specific, all lowercase.
Exactly. Open source tool on GitHub called Terraform docs that you can use to generate module documentation with. If you're building providers, it's TF plugin docs. And that actually looks at your module, it looks at the Terraform configuration, and it documents the input arguments and the outputs, and whether there's a default value, the description, if something is required or not. Yep.
So that implies that you've written good descriptions for your inputs and your outputs, correct?
You should, yes.
He's totally leading the witness at this point. I mean, yeah, you, in order to get, this is kind of like open API specification. If you don't like annotate your REST APIs with good documentation, then the open API spec is just going to produce, garbage documentation. Make sure that you annotate your interfaces, like your inputs, your outputs, so that you can benefit from the magic of Terraform docs when it outputs really good documentation. You gotta have it. You gotta have your code annotated. So absolutely.
Might be helpful.
I would likely not approve a PR if input argument isn't documented. Same.
Dang, so mean, Bruno. Oh, all right. Smash the like button if you have ever submitted and merged into main an input variable without a description on it. Let's see how many likes we get on this video because of that.
For an output value. No.
When you're organizing the inputs and the outputs alphabetical order, group them by function.
Alphabetical order? Oh my god, no way, man. Like, I have an opinion here, but like, let's see what they say.
Good one. Well, required ones on the top and optional on the bottom, and I try to put things together that belong together. Yeah.
I have a feeling
I think
that some people
TF
might
docs
disagree.
organizes them for you,
Yeah?
doesn't it?
Okay.
It sorts for you. So in the variables at TF, yeah, you can organize it that way.
In the documentation that gets outputted, I guess I'm thinking about in the input variable file. There's a certain order that I go in. I'll have to look into this, because I declare my input variables in a certain way. I don't necessarily know if Terraform docs is going to output them the way I intended them to. That's a good question. I'll have to go look into that because I absolutely, just like Bruno said, I think about Of course, required and then optional. But even like within the required, there's a certain order of operations. It's like bigger to smaller. Like what's the most important thing down to the least important thing. So within that segment of required. But then also like what goes together is another aspect of like grouping, just kind of like, in terms of like proximity to other input variables that are related to each other, or relevant to each other. I tend to have kind of an unspoken grouping based on order of the input variables. I don't know if that comes through in the documentation. So I think that's a good question. I'll have to go look into that. If you know the answer, throw it in the comments below.
So one other thing that I like to add in is I think everybody loves pictures, right? Like pictures can convey so much more than paragraphs of explanation. So I try to make sure that I include, some good descriptive information on what's being built, what users should expect, what the major, decision points are for them. And then I try to include diagrams that would show different types of uses. You can also put those diagrams in your examples repo too.
So diagram like it's a load balancer with an EC2, so you provide a diagram with the load balancer and EC2. So you see it's a visualization of what you're deploying?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool, nice.
Completely agree. If you got time, this is a little bit, ideal best case scenario. But yeah, like it comes down to communication. I would chalk this up with communication, like to the consumer of your module. What the crap is this thing going to go do, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words, to Drew's point there, right? If you can explain it with one picture rather than blah, 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 a bunch of gibberish, go for it. Imparting clarity about the intent of, what your module is going to go do for the consumer is absolutely critical. So throw in a diagram. I use OmniGraffle. I love OmniGraffle. Throw in a PNG, into your examples folder, reference it from your README, make sure that it's embedded somewhere within, the Terraform docs output that you're producing.
That is very helpful because sometimes you look at the module naming and you think you know what's in there, but having that picture, it lines up better. Okay, yes, this is the module for me.
Then again, if you need a visualization to understand what a module does, I think that's also quite painful. But I think it's a nice addition. Yeah.
I don't know if I buy that, Bruno. That would be a very low bar to set. I'm sorry, that would be a very high bar to set. It's almost like the argument that like my code doesn't require documentation. It should be immediately obvious like what my code is doing. And I don't know if I buy that.
I think you just threw some shade on. Ouch. I like a good picture. It's okay.
Okay.
When should you not write a module?
Oh, there's a lot of times you don't need to write a module. I'm strongly against the idea of pushing and forcing everyone in your company to use modules. I think a lot of folks use it to force like security standards and compliance standards. You don't force security and compliance standards using modules. You force them with organizational policies and everything that's in AWS or in Google Cloud to prevent someone from deploying a S3 bucket that is public access on. I think it's great to provide modules if they solve a particular problem. I really think that a module should do one thing and it should do it good. I'm not a big fan of a module that exposes all the possible inputs and exposes all the possible outputs, because you have then created a wrapper module and I could have just used provider level resources. So if there's a good use case for it, I'll provide a module if it offers a certain abstraction to a team. And sometimes I build the same type of modules, but for different teams.
And I think that's a great idea. That comes down to, you don't have to solve all the world's problems, right? You can build in some opinionatedness into the module rather than trying to create one module to rule them all. So I completely agree with that. Also, I agree with his point about resource wrappers. Don't create resource wrappers. Don't create a module, just because you can. Create a module to add value. either to simplify life for the developer or to encapsulate some sort of logic or functionality, so that somebody doesn't have to think through that and implement it themselves over and over and over again. And just like Bruno said, I've seen places where modules are kind of used by some governing body as a way of control, right? As a way of like not letting people get their work done. I don't think modules should be, necessarily like a way to enforce policy. So be careful in taking like an extremely dogmatic approach to like everything must be in a module, right? That's an extreme stance, okay? However, that is not like saying that like everything doesn't have to be in a module is not the same thing as like saying we should encapsulate some common, well-known best practices into modules and then distribute them across our organization. Like that's okay to do. Like you should do that. And that's not the same thing as thou shalt use modules for everything.
So some teams, not everyone needs the same level of abstraction. A data scientist team needs a very different level of abstraction to a workload team that completely runs everything on EKS. And I would give them a different EKS module than the ones I would give to the data scientists.
I don't see his point here. It's not always about abstraction. It's more about the use case, right? And AKS may not be the best example because AKS is essentially plumbing, but I would imagine that both of these two groups that he's talking about are going to need the same plumbing. It's just what goes on top of that that plumbing that's going to be different. But of course, I think what he's trying to say is like certain different teams are going to have different use cases, and therefore they're going to very likely need different modules, and that's okay. And I agree with him there.
Yeah, sure.
One thing I might add is don't write modules that do everything.
Yeah, the wrapper.
So we're writing them to
Agree completely.
inject opinions and to help users to deploy, complicated structures in a simple way. So make sure that, you have tightly scoped modules.
Scope creep is a real thing.
Amen.
It is.
I've certainly encountered it myself.
This is like I wrote an article about the mega module, like the module that does everything. Don't do that, right? The mega module can take many forms. It can be, have tentacles into like every different pie, or it can just be like the Swiss Army knife of like a certain like use case. Like it tries to do like an AKS module that's every AKS module under the sun, right? Like no, that's still, you're still trying to achieve every single possible scenario with one module. It diminishes the value that module has.
This has been fascinating. I've learned a little bit. Hopefully the audience has learned a little bit. I'd like to take a moment to thank you, Bruno, and you, Drew, for agreeing to be on this panel and doing all the work so I can just sit here and enjoy it.
Ned is so modest. Anyways, yeah, it was a great talk. Of course, I think on the ambassador bus that later that day, I told Ned I agree with about 76.1% of what that was said. After doing the math, I think my prediction was pretty good. But a lot of great insights. Some stuff that I didn't agree with, but most of the stuff, I completely agree with. Hopefully you guys found my ramblings on this topic interesting and valuable. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with me on some of my hotter takes. Let me know. Module design, module development are definitely hot topics where there's like literally, I think, just a gap in definitive prescriptive guidance on what to do. And that's largely because it's a really hard topic, because Terraform modules can be almost anything. I mean, it's a very wide topic. So really it's almost like trying to provide prescriptive guidance on how to write a method, right, in Python. I mean, so it's a big topic which has tons of nuance and idiosyncrasies galore. Let me know what your comments are. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. And definitely smash like on this video if you appreciated my thoughts on this subject. Let me know. Anyways, until next time, this is the Azure Terraformer, signing off.